At this point, I don't think Professor John Mearsheimer needs much of an introduction, certainly not to our audience. He's appeared on our show many times. He's always one of the most popular, if not the most popular guest who appears for very good reasons. I think there are a few people more informed and independent and courageous and willing to break from orthodoxy if he feels it's necessary in international relations generally. We've had him on many times to talk about the multiple wars the United States is involved in, including in Israel and including in Ukraine, but other places as well. And he, as I said, is the author of a very relevant book, which is the Israel Lobby, that he co-authored with Harvard professor Stephen Walt, that documents the power of the pro-Israel faction in the United States that continues to ensure that American policy is constructed, whether under the Republicans or Democrats, to promote the interest of the Israeli government and the state of Israel. And we are always delighted to welcome him to the show. Professor Mearsheimer, it is great to see you as always. Thank you for taking the time to come on.
Thank you for having me, Glenn.
Absolutely. So from the start of the October 7th, when we've had many discussions about what was going on in the Middle East, one of the concerns that we often discussed, and I know you've talked about in other venues as well, is the real danger that this could escalate, namely the Israeli bombing campaign in Gaza, but also the skirmishes that have been ongoing with Hezbollah in the northern part of Israel and the southern part of Lebanon. And it seems like, I think it's pretty clear to say that that has now escalated. There is something resembling a regional war. Hopefully it won't go to its full extent. But it seems like it's there. Is there any doubt in your mind that A, there is now a regional war with Israel involving multiple other countries, including Iran, and that B, this is something that Netanyahu has pursued and even wanted?
Well, it's clear to me that there are sort of three major conflicts that are somewhat interconnected, but also somewhat independent of each other. One is what's been going on since October 7th in Gaza, and that's the conflict against Hamas. And then there's the conflict in Lebanon, which of course involves Hezbollah. And then there's the conflict involving Iran. And all three of these conflicts are very dangerous conflicts. But at this point in time, it appears to me that the most dangerous of those three conflicts is the Iran-Israeli conflict, because of what happened on October 1st. I think the potential for escalation is great there. I think the situation in Lebanon is really dire, and it would be wonderful if we could put an end to it, which we won't do. But I think the possibility of escalation there is not as great as it is with regard to Iran.
So we'll get to Iran in obviously just a little bit, and I entirely agree that that's the most dangerous component of this. But let's just stick to Lebanon for a moment. For a long time, we've been hearing about this massive stockpile of precision, long-range weapons, or at least weapons that can reach deep into Israel, that Hezbollah has and is able to use. And we've seen them use some of that, nowhere near their full capacity. But now what we're seeing as well is some kind of a ground invasion on the part of the Israeli military into Lebanon. And the last time this happened in 2006, it was a very bloody, difficult, protracted war for Israel. And it seems like already in just the first 2 or 3 days, we've seen a good number of IDF soldiers killed. Just in terms of the part of this which has become the ground invasion into Lebanon, how extensive do you think that's likely to go, and how difficult do you think that will be for Israel?
Well, let me just make one sort of preparatory point before I answer that. The Israelis are pursuing three different strategies towards Hezbollah. One is the decapitation strategy, where they killed Nasrallah, and that's not going to work. The second is the punishment strategy, where they're basically murdering huge numbers of civilians or forcing them out of their homes, and that's not going to work. And therefore, it's not surprising that they're talking about, or they've executed, a ground invasion. what's interesting about it is there's hardly any news on what's going on. I searched all the Israeli newspapers that I read today to see if I could get some sense of what's going on, and it's very hard to find anything. Yesterday, there were all sorts of stories that an Israeli force in Lebanon had been ambushed, and there were 8 killed, 8 IDF soldiers were killed, and there were many wounded soldiers. And this, of course, is what we expected, because the IDF was going into a hornet's nest, number one. And number two, the IDF is basically exhausted from the Gaza campaign. So it wasn't surprising to see that they had all this trouble right off the bat. But if you look at the newspapers today in Israel and even in the West, there's just hardly any news. And as you and I both know, if the Israelis were making significant progress, we'd be hearing about it. And the fact that we're not hearing anything makes me think that they're already in deep trouble, which I would not find surprising. I'm not saying that's the case. But you see, the problem that the Israelis have, again, is decapitation doesn't work, punishment doesn't work, and now a ground invasion doesn't work. So where does that leave them? It leaves them facing facing Hezbollah, and this Hezbollah is capable of still firing rockets into Israel. By most accounts, they launched 150 rockets into northern Israel yesterday, and they launched 130 rockets into northern Israel today. So the idea that Israel is silencing Hezbollah or is on the verge of defeating Hezbollah is simply not true.
I think the interesting part of what you said about the Israeli media report is that pretty much every Israeli media report is under very strict censorship. In fact, when you had a terrorist attack in Yaffa in Tel Aviv, and it was only about 12 hours later when the Israeli media began to report on the number of victims, their names, and when they did so, they basically said, we're able to report this because the government has cleared this for publication, meaning they decided that they were going to allow us to publish this information. Yesterday, as you said, there was clear reports in the Israeli press that there was an ambush and 8 IDF soldiers were killed. I think they confirmed one more death today. And you have a lot of news reports from Lebanese media, from regional media, from Al Jazeera, from informal channels like Telegram, and even from Twitter, that are suggesting that there's a lot more damage to the IDF already imposed than the Israeli military has, or the Israeli press has been able to report. But let me ask you this argument that you made where you said decapitation doesn't work. I think a lot of people believed that when they started with that pager attack and the walkie-talkies that made everyone so excited about the genius of this attack, followed by the killing of Nasrallah and other top leaders of Hezbollah, I think a lot of people felt like, well, if you decapitate the leadership of Hezbollah and you render their communication devices unusable because they're now weapons in the hands of the Israelis, that of course you're going to hamper Hezbollah to a significant extent. Why isn't that true?
Well, first of all, just on decapitation, we have a rich literature in the international relations scholarly world that shows that decapitation simply doesn't work. And some of the best evidence that it doesn't work comes from the Israeli case. The Israelis have been running around the Middle East assassinating leaders for a long, long time, and it's never had any significant consequences. And you kill Nasrallah, somebody will come in and replace him. And when they killed Nasrallah's predecessor in 1992 and Nasrallah came in, the end result was they got a more effective leader. And you may get an even more effective leader or an equally effective leader this time. So just, decapitating, knocking off the head of an organization like Hezbollah is not going to fundamentally change the nature of the situation. They're still going to have 40,000 fighters who are well positioned and well prepared to take on the Israelis, and who have many, many thousands of rockets and missiles that they can fire at Israel. So, the decapitation strategy just doesn't work. What you have to do is you have to go in and you have to degrade those Hezbollah fighting forces in southern Lebanon. You have to eradicate them. Look, just go to Gaza for a second. As you know, they've been fighting against Hamas for a very, very long time. And their goal, according to Prime Minister Netanyahu, has been to decisively defeat Hamas. They have not decisively defeated Hamas. They have not even come close. Well, if they didn't defeat Hamas, they're certainly not going to defeat Hezbollah. The terrain is much more advantageous to the defender in Lebanon than it is in Gaza. And furthermore, Hezbollah is much better armed and much better prepared than the fighters in Gaza are. So the Israelis are in a hopeless situation. They're not going to win in Lebanon.
I think people sometimes forget the climate and the discourse that emerged after 9/11 in the United States. And I don't know if you recall this, but one of the things the U.S. military's propaganda arm did was they issued playing cards to identify all the leaders of the Ba'athist regime. Like Saddam Hussein was like the ace of spades, and then everyone else had like the ace of diamonds and the jacks, and they would publish these, and every time they killed one of them, they would kind of cross them off on the website, and the media would celebrate this, and within about 2 months, most of them were gone or driven underground or killed, and obviously the Iraqi insurgency did not get crippled. In fact, it was a very strong insurgency that continued for many years. And you even see that in law enforcement. If there's wars the government has with drug gangs, they kill the gang leader or the biggest trafficker, and then someone else gets into that place. Obviously, the gang doesn't go away, and a lot of times they're even more violent or less reasonable or more radicalized, something that obviously might happen in Lebanon as well. But nonetheless, let me ask you this. In terms of, we talked last time a lot about Israeli motives, and I know they're hard to discern politically, but just in terms of the military strategy, clearly Netanyahu and other key members of his government seem to be thinking and saying, this is the moment we've been waiting for a long time, where we have the kind of license to finally destroy all of our enemies, particularly coming from Iran and its proxies like Hezbollah and Hamas and even Iran itself. But as you just said, in order to destroy Hezbollah, something far more formidable than destroying Hamas, they're going to need to do a ground invasion. I presume the Israelis know everything that you just got done saying, which is the last time they tried that, it was almost like a Vietnam situation. It would be very, very difficult. Hezbollah has been preparing this for many, many years with the help of Iran. Very, very sophisticated military. So what do you think is motivating Netanyahu in terms of the goal, the strategy of what they hope to achieve by doing a ground invasion into Lebanon and flattening a lot of apartment buildings in Beirut?
You can give two answers to that, Glenn. I mean, I've thought about this question, which you've asked many times, because it is the $64,000 question here. One answer, which sort of pops in my head immediately, is that they're just plain nuts. They're out of control, and they think that they can use this big stick to reorder the Middle East quickly and easily, and it's all going to work out. And you just sort of say to yourself, they can't possibly believe that, and if they do believe that, then they are irrational in the extreme. That's one answer. The other answer is the ultimate goal here is to expel the Palestinians from Gaza and from the West Bank, and to create a rather homogeneous greater Israel. And what they need to do that is a huge conflagration. The two big ethnic cleansing that have previously taken place involving the Palestinians were in 1948, of course, the famous Nakba, and in 1967 in the wake of the process of the Six-Day War, when they drove a couple 100,000 Palestinians out of the West Bank. And these two previous examples show you that you really need a major league conflict to provide an opportunity to do ethnic cleansing. So one could make an argument that they would actually welcome a conflagration with Iran, and they would welcome seeing things spin out of control, because this would give them the opportunity to do the cleansing that they really want to do. So that's the sort of rational explanation. But if you don't buy that explanation, I just think they're nuts, because what they're doing, both in Gaza and against Hezbollah in Lebanon, and with regard to Iran, which we'll talk about, makes no strategic sense to me.
I recall very vividly, because it was such a remarkable statement, that shortly after October 7th, when the Israelis were saying, oh, we need to destroy Hamas and get our hostages back, and that's the goal of our military operation, the former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett gave an interview to The Economist, and he was much more candid, I think, about what at least he and his group of allies were thinking, and they're pretty close to the Netanyahu government. What he said was, what we really need to do now, what we intend to do now, is to show the region that there are no limits on what we're willing to do. No one can stop us. There's nothing anyone can do to stop us. And there's no moral or ethical limits that we will observe in order to defend ourselves. And what we intend to do is put the fear of God, or the fear of Jews is how he described it, into the hearts and minds of every Arab in the region, that they will remember for generations, so that they will be too afraid to ever again oppose us or attack us. That's at least a coherent rationale, whatever you think of the morality or ethics of it. But is it something that you think is a viable strategy for achieving that goal, namely making people just simply too scared to watch the Israelis, what they're going to do, and not want that to be done to them?
No. As I said before, when I was describing the three strategies the Israelis have available for Lebanon, I said one was decapitation, two was punishment, and three was invasion. And what you're describing is the punishment strategy. Punishment is where you go out and you murder huge numbers of civilians. It's, by the way, what we did in World War II in Europe, but especially against Japan, starting on March 10th, 1945, and going forward to August 9th, when we dropped the second bomb on Nagasaki. I mean, we were basically burning Japanese cities to the ground, murdering huge numbers of people. And we thought that would get the population to turn against the Japanese government. And earlier in Europe, we thought the bombing of places like Dresden and Hamburg would get German people to turn against the German government. It doesn't work. Punishment is not a viable strategy. So the Israelis, who have a rich history of inflicting massive civilian casualties on people in the Arab world, have never seen that strategy work. It doesn't work with the Palestinians. You had a first intifada, you had a second intifada, then you had October 7th. And if you continue to have a greater Israel that's an apartheid state, you're going to have another October 7th or another intifada, because people absorb huge amounts of punishment, and they don't cave in almost all cases, and they come back to fight another day.